Hey guys, it's your boy, Ballface8020, back again with another great commentary. And this is a special one tonight. I don't think, some people may like this video, some people may not. I don't, expect, given the subject matter, I don't think it's going to get a lot of views. But this is, I think, going to be the most important video I've ever made, to me. I feel obligated to make this video now due to, the upsurge in anti-Semitism. And I would encourage, and I don't think I've never done this before, but if you know somebody who is interested in this conflict on either side, or maybe they don't have a side, maybe they're just interested, I would encourage you to send this video to them. Because I think that this video is, you're going to hear stuff in this video that you're not going to be able to get anywhere else. And I think that whatever side or of the conflict you're on, that that the perspective you're going to get here is going to be valuable to you. So here is how I want to do it. I have made notes and I have broken it into 4 sections, okay? Section 1 is going to be about my history with Zionism and the State of Israel. Section 2 is going to be about the Jewish history in the land of Israel, leading up to and then past the birth of the Zionist movement. I don't want to give a history lesson, but I feel like some basic historical background is necessary. The historical part is going to be something that I believe is very balanced, and I think it's going to be something that, again, whichever side of the conflict you're on, you wouldn't have a problem with it. So it's not going to be like a bunch of propaganda for, like the Jewish side over the Palestinian side. I think it's something that that everything I say is going to be stuff people generally agree with, regardless of ideology or point of view. In section 3, I want to talk about how Judaism and Zionism relate to each other, and like what are the differences, and like, how, I don't know, just how they relate to each other. I'll just leave it at that. And section 4 is, I want to talk about the current situation politically in America, all of the Israel stuff, because it's important for me to talk about it, because that's why I'm making this video, is responding to that, to what's going on in America about this. And then I want to touch on the war itself in Gaza. Hopefully we can do this in under an hour. If you've seen my last video, you would know this, that I really actually don't, despite being Jewish, I do not have a Zionist background. I was not, my family didn't practice Judaism, and they weren't pro-Israel. They weren't anti-Israel, and they just wasn't something they thought about or talked about. I only got into Israel after 9/11, because, like after 9/11, as you started hearing a lot about it, there was like, the president at the time, George W. Bush, his idea had been kind of like to stay away from the conflict, because just the idea is unsolvable, to just not to just minimize U.S. involvement. And, I can't remember if the second Intifada had already started when he got in office or not, but he was avoiding it. But after, after like 9/11 and the need to get buy-in from the moderate Islamic states, he got more involved in the peace process there. So that's why I started researching about it, reading about like history of Israel, politics of Israel. So initially, I was a big fan of Ariel Sharon and Bibi Netanyahu. I know you guys all know who Bibi Netanyahu is. He was still around in all the way back in 2001. He actually came onto the scene in the mid-90s, or the early mid-90s. Actually, even before that, really. But the but for Ariel Sharon, you younger guys probably don't remember. He was this fat piece of shit who he wasn't even Jewish. He was what's called a Subutnik. They're like these. So he was a descendant of these people in the Russian Empire who had like in southern Russia who had like they initially they were just Christians who like thought the Sabbath was on Saturday instead of Sunday. But then, like, over the course of, like, 100 years or whatever, some of them would end up actually just making a full conversion to Judaism. And except they really didn't. They learned about Judaism, and so some of them would immigrated to pre-state Israel, and then kind of got like became sort of like Jews by culture, but they never really formally converted. And so the thing is now, granted, Sharon's father was an ethnic Jew, but in Judaism it goes by your mom. So his mom's a Subutnik. We don't consider that real Jew. We don't consider that to be Jewish. If his mom had converted before he was born, then that would be one thing, but she didn't. But anyway, that's not it. The problem wasn't that he wasn't Jewish. The problem is that he was a fat piece of shit. I really don't have anything good to say about that, to say about him. So, but anyway, at first I liked him. Again, I was new to the thing, so I liked him. I was like, oh, he's, a hard ass. He's good. And then, I got disenchanted with him pretty quickly. Again, this was during the Second Intifada, and his fat ass did absolutely nothing. And so I was more into Bibi, because, like, Bibi's like, oh, okay, well, he's, the problem is Sharon. When Sharon's weak, but when Bibi gets back in, he'll stop all this terrorism stuff. And, but, so finding that's how I, kept reading and researching it. But, I eventually found, this, he was already dead at the time, a rabbi named Meir Kahana. In America is usually called Kahan, in Israel it's Kahana. And I've actually been asked about him before, so I guess some people, he's been dead for a long time, but some people still know about him apparently. And now keep in mind, at this time, I myself was a very resolute atheist. So all the stuff like that Kahana said about Judaism, I thought was just nonsense. But a lot of the stuff he said about like the conflict, when I actually read his stuff, like made a lot of sense to me. So if you don't understand what Kahana believed, basically what he wanted to do was end democracy in Israel and, turn it into a theocracy. He wanted a king, and he probably wanted himself to be that king. He wanted to destroy the Alaska Mosque that's in Jerusalem and replace it with the Third Temple. And he always made a really big deal about this. Like, he always said that, like, he was really against Jews saying that we want to build the Third Temple. He said, because when you say you want to build the Third Temple, you're skipping the most important step. What you need to say is, we want to destroy the Alaska Mosque so we can then build the Third Temple. It's like, he said, it's a two-pronged thing, and you have to say both of them. And so he made a really big deal about that. And then what he's most famous for is wanting to expel the Palestinians from not just Gaza, and then Judea and Samaria is what you call the West Bank, but he said even the ones who live in Israel, in the borders of 1967 Israel, and have Israeli citizenship, they needed to be forcibly expelled too. And, when he was asked, like, if they don't voluntarily go, are you going to put them on cattle cars and ship them out? And he said yes. So he was like very extreme and very clear about how extreme he was. Like I said, I didn't agree with the religious stuff because I was an atheist at this time. But like all the stuff he said made a lot of sense to me, at the time, about about how to deal with the Palestinians and, Palestinian terrorism. And, so So let's see here. Oh, okay, right. So here is, even though first section 1 is supposed to be how I got into like Zionism, I want to do an aside here about like Kahana's ideology and who he was. I gave you the basics, right? And what he used to say is, he would say this to his Jewish critics in Israel. He would say, "I say what you think." The like, because you basically, that everything I say is true. That the Palestinians who live in Israel are not the Uncle Ahmads that you portray them as, that they're actually all Palestinian nationalists who want us all either dead or out of here. And, that demographically we can't match up with the Palestinians. They're always going to outbreed us. And, that expelling them from the land of Israel is the only way to do it. So he got a lot of popularity with that. Like I said, all of that stuff spoke to me because, again, I was young, I was radical, I was angry. And then, but I think, what's interesting, about Kahane and, why I'm so, one other thing about him, he was obsessed with this idea of Arab guys, but particularly Palestinian guys, sleeping with Jewish girls. Like, it drove him insane. Like this idea that, like, I'm not talking about rape. I'm talking about just like sleeping with. And he actually, when he was in the Knesset, tried to pass laws making it illegal for Palestinian guys to sleep with Jewish girls. And, it was just like, like he would bring it up all the time. And, it was, that was, even at the time, I didn't like it. It just was too weird to me. It seemed like, and he would even say, like, he did this, at least, he had a reputation as being like anti-black from like when he was clashing with them back in America. I've read a lot of his stuff. I really don't think he was. I think that, but one thing he did mention is that he says, like, if a Palestinian guy sleeps with a Jewish girl, it's got nothing to do with love or attraction. He's doing it for the same reason, like, a black nationalist in America sleeps with a white girl. He thinks that this is his way to get back. And I just thought that that was like a really weird thing to say. And, I always, like, when I see people saying stuff like this, whatever their ethnicity is, I'm always like thinking, like, are you like getting off on this? I just like, I don't know. It gets to a point where I feel like he doth protest too much. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't get it. I think it's weird. And, I just think it's dumb. But I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, obviously, I don't think, especially in Israel, but really, I don't think it's a good idea for a Jewish girl to marry a Palestinian guy. She's probably going to get the shit kicked out of her, and then obviously, yeah, it's against Jewish law. But I mean, I don't see which. I mean, I don't know. Is it really that big a phenomena? Like, I know it happens, okay, but you can work with it without like making like a bunch of Nuremberg style laws, against it, which just makes you, because how that's going to play. It just looks ridiculous. But then, but here's the thing, right? With Kahane, if his theology is really unique, because Kahana would say that, like, he even actually said this once. He said, Judaism is revenge. He said, Judaism is, a Jewish fist in the astonished Goyish face of the world. So he really promoted militancy and revenge, and he was just a really angry guy, and he really hated Palestinians and left-wing Jews. And now he denied this. He denied this, of course, but it's just obvious if you read his stuff that he did hate them. And, you know, I'm not here to condemn him for that, okay? What I am here is to say that it's not Judaism, right? Because, you know, the Jews have always had enemies, right? And you can go read the Jewish sages from whenever, right? And what's most interesting is if you read like the writings of rabbis who were there during the Holocaust, read their writings, like about what they were saying. And when they talk about, I'm not even talking about the German civilians, I'm talking about like the concentration camp guards and stuff, you know, they never speak with any anger or hatred towards them. They're not saying that they love them and they're praying for them or any of that stuff. That would be Christianity, not Judaism. But they don't hate them. They just like, you know, because that's not what Judaism. In fact, Judaism really makes it. If you go back and read, you know, the Jewish sages, it's actually important not only that you're not supposed to ever hate anybody, but you're not ever supposed to be angry at them. And that, you know, like anger is considered a type of idolatry. And it is like those. I don't have the citation for you, but it may be from the Talmud. I don't remember, where it says that you take like the best scholar. They mean like the best Jewish scholar in the world. If he loses his temper, he loses all of his wisdom. And the thing is, you know, you can think about in your own life, you know, how many of the things that you regret or you're ashamed of did you do because you were angry and you were blinded by anger. And like for me, it's like a lot of the stuff that I regret and I'm ashamed of is because I was so angry, you know, and I leaned into it. And I can just like, I can't speak for anybody else, but for myself, and I think this is true for everybody else though, like I do not think clearly when I'm angry. Like I just like it completely warps my judgment, and you know all I can think about is getting even. And not only is that no way to live your life, but it leads to bad decision making. So Kahana like turned this on his head. He said like instead of like not only is it he said not only is it okay, it's actually required to be angry and hateful and act on it. You had to embrace it. And this is why he came off like such a lunatic. And while the people, you know, in Israel today who are inspired by it, I mean, you hear them talk and they're crazy. You know, they sound insane. So that's the aside about Kahain. But anyway, so the second Intifada was going on. That piece of shit Sharon was still in office, and then he I'm not going to get into all the inside baseball stuff that was going on in Israeli politics, but he then decided to destroy all the Jewish settlements that were in Gaza. Back then, there were still Jewish settlements in Gaza. The biggest one was called Gush Katif. He destroyed all those, and he was able to do it with, you know, the Uncle Tom. Again, it's going to be too much. It would be too much inside baseball, but he was able to go through with it, and so that switched it from me, like that whole event, like I no longer saw the Palestinians as the main enemy. I saw the main enemy was not just left-wing Jews, but really just any Jew in Israel who wasn't a right-winger. Because most Jews supported destroying the Gaza settlements. Most Israeli Jews, I mean. And like, and I hated him for it. I hated Sharon, and I hated the people who voted for Sharon, which was most Israeli Jews. And, you know, I wanted to get back at him, so I became really alienated from the state. And it had gotten to a point because, so Sharon destroyed the settlements in Gaza and then a few in northern Samaria. And then, but quickly after that, he lapsed into a coma, which he was in for the next 8 years before he finally died. And so his successor, Ehud Olmert, took over, and this guy may have been an even, I don't know, they're both horrible. It's tough to say which one was worse than the other, but Olmert took over. And his idea, they had this thing called the convergence plan, because when they destroyed the settlements in Gaza, that was like, I think it was something like 7,000 or 8,000 settlers in Gaza, and then 2,000 in Samaria. So it wasn't like they had to relocate like a total of like 9,000 people, which they did a horrible job of, by the way. And then they but what they were going to do then was do the same thing in all of Judea and Samaria, which at the time, but not all of Judea, like, because what you call the West Bank is divided by like this separation barrier, and most of the barrier is like close to the borders of 1967 Israel. There's this like one part where like a finger sticks out for this settlement called Ariel, and that's like, I think, like 12 kilometers in or something. And that's where most of, like, if you ever hear about the settlers, most of them live inside that fence. At the time that this convergence plan goes, there was about 60,000 who lived outside of the fence. And the Olmert was supposedly going to take them all back. And it was very clear, like, that this was going to lead to civil war. You know, that you were trying to do 60,000. They had some Uncle Toms within the settlers that let them get away with the Gaza stuff that had all been discredited. So there was going to be a civil war. Everybody knew. I mean, that's not true. Most Israelis didn't, but the Israeli intelligence agencies were public, saying that this is going to cause a civil war. But then, and I just figured out that was how it was going to go. But it never ended up happening because Hamas took over in Gaza and kidnapped the soldier Gilad Shalit. So all of a sudden, people were kind of worried about leaving Judea and Samaria, and then so like for Olmert to try to like build up his credibility, so because he didn't have the credibility that Sharon did. For him to get the credibility to do the Judea and Samaria withdrawal, Hezbollah had kidnapped a few Israeli soldiers, and he launched this entire war, like this total overreaction, because he was trying to like show that he was a tough guy and get credibility. Israel proceeded to lose that war at one of the most humiliating defeats ever. Once that happened, it was over. There was no way to do the Judea and Samaria withdrawal. That was the end of it. And there's never really been a serious threat of any settlement dismantling since. But anyways, like, yeah, look, I continued to follow it from time to time, but for the most part, from 2006 on, like, once I realized there wasn't going to be a civil war, I was just kind of like, I washed my hands with this. I don't like, I was becoming more interested in American politics, and I just felt so alienated from the state of Israel and from most of its population that I just moved on. And we will, yeah, okay. So I want to, before I go to the next section, which is, or not before, the next section is like the Jewish history and the land of Israel. This is just some background overview. So what happened is, and I'm only going to start from like the Roman era on. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but basically in 67 AD, there was a massive revolt in Judea against Roman rule. And that's when, it lasted 3 years. That's when the Second Temple got destroyed. So ever since then, there hasn't been a temple. And, which, caused some changes within Judaism. But as bad as that revolt was, because everybody's heard of that one, and then as bad as that revolt was, 60 years later, there was an even worse one called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that's when that revolt, you had the second revolt within 100 years. After that revolt ended, that's when you saw the Romans actually like try to do things to change the demography to prevent any future revolts. So like the country was still mostly Jewish, even after the Bar Kokhba revolt, but it was less so. Like as they brought in some more colonists, and a lot of Jews got killed or expelled, and yeah. So, but it was still mostly Jewish. And it would stay that way for a long time. In fact, the Roman Empire would give way to the Byzantine Empire, still mostly Jewish there, because the Byzantines ruled it. There was a brief period where, this is ironic, Iran actually conquered the land of Israel from the Byzantines, and this was in like the late 7th century. and they like formed an alliance with the local Jewish population. So the Jews did rule. They had like an autonomous like enclave in Jerusalem for a while, I think for a few years, and then before the Byzantines took it back over, and then after that the Arabs took it over, and the rest is history. So what you'd have happened is like by the time the Arabs conquer, we don't know this for sure because it's tough with ancient and medieval demography, but there's reason to believe that by the time, because obviously the Romans and Byzantines are Christians, so they're like bringing in a lot of Christians to the land, and there were already non-Jews, non-Samaritans there as well. So they all eventually they converted to Christianity. So it's possible, maybe even likely, that by the time the Muslims conquered the land of Israel, we can call it Palestine, whatever you want to call it, that it was still mostly Jewish and Samaritan, and then maybe like 40 or 45% Christian. I don't know. So over the course then of centuries, you'd see some Jews and Samaritans would leave. They'd go to the other communities around there. I mean, overall, the population just declined. Like, it got like, I think it had, I think that like when the Muslims conquered it, it was supposedly had like 1 million people, around 1 million people. And then it got to a point at some point where it was like as low as 100,000. So the population just overall declined a lot. But then like, the, like demography of the population changed too. It went from a place that was mostly Jewish Samaritan and then with like a large minority of Christians, and then and obviously there were no Muslims then because Islam was new. But you'd see it change to the country becomes increasingly Islamic. So what you have is, a lot of Jews and Samaritans died, and a lot left for greener pastures. But, we know that a lot just converted to Islam, like a lot converted to Islam. So, that's part of, Palestinian history. So during this whole time, right, that, you always had Jews making what's called aliyah. Okay, that's when you're a Jew who lives outside of Israel immigrates to Israel. So that's been going on, the whole time. There's nothing new about that or Zionist about that. It just it's something that's always existed. And but it wasn't enough so even though you had Jews constantly moving in, it didn't make up for the amount of Jews that were leaving or converting to Islam. So no matter how many Jews kept coming, it was never able to reverse, stop, or even really slow down the demographic decline. But this got to a point where in the early 19th century, there were 9,000 Jews in all of Palestine. I'm not really sure how many Palestinians there were. I've heard a whole bunch of different numbers. There was, a hell of a lot, way more than 9,000. By the time Zionism started, so that would be 1881, there were 23,000. And in 1881, formal Zionist, what we would call Zionist colonization of Palestine begins. And this is different because, like I said, Jews had always have always made aliyah to the land of Israel. That's not new. What is new is to be an organized, massive, multinational movement, even though it was mostly from Russia, and with the purposes of creating a self-sustaining community there. Okay, because Jews had always immigrated to the land of Israel, sometimes in large groups for the time, but generally they were going to just go and like live in the cities, and like they were doing it because they were maybe trying to bring the Messiah. or whatever. But these people, the first Aliyah, they are not trying to bring the Messiah. And they're not going to live in cities. They're going to drain the swamps and farm and build, like I said, a self-sustaining culture there. Now, some of them, I'm sure, wanted to build a state. It doesn't seem like at this stage that it certainly wasn't a consensus. Another thing is these people they're mostly secular. They're not all of them. Some of them are, but most of them are secular. They're mostly from the Russian Empire. Again, not all of them. There was like a pretty big chunk from Yemen, but that's what they're doing. And the Palestinians did not react well to this at all. They now before Zionism, right? The Palestinians already treated the Jews there like shit. They murder them and stole from them and stuff, but it was just kind of like the normal murder and stealing. It wasn't like like organized mass terrorism. That's what they started doing because there was no reason for them to, because there was no political threat. But once you start seeing like the mass immigration with the goal of maybe creating a state, but at least creating a some type of autonomy or something, or some type of civilization, that's when you saw the real hostile, violent reaction. And at first it started slowly, but it got pretty bad. Now, at this time, it was Palestine, you want to call it, was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. And as long as the Ottomans are Muslim, as long as the Ottomans rule it, there was never going to be a Jewish state there. So they were going to allow like a certain level of Jewish immigration, partly because of pressure from France, Russia, and the UK. Maybe it was still called England then. Partly from just because it's a way to build more tax revenue, because they were trying to they wanted to build up that part of their empire. And but they weren't going to allow a state. They'd say okay, yeah, you small numbers of you can come to work if you want to go and farm or whatever, but we're not going to let you keep having Jews immigrate until they're the majority of the country, and then maybe become an independent state there. The Ottomans bet on the wrong horse in World War I. They lose Palestine to the British. The British take it over and say that they're going to make a national home for the Jews there. Not necessarily a state, but a national home. So at this point, it would be formalized as in the British Mandate of Palestine in 1922. It would end in 1947. That was the League of Nations gave it to them. So I want to talk about the reaction now to Zionism from three different groups. The religious Zionists, the Haredi Jews, and the Middle Eastern Jews. Now, like I said, the Zionists, right? Who came over and were settling it, were overwhelmingly secular from Russian Empire, Eastern Europe, and then as things the first Aliyah was from that, but the second Aliyah you start seeing Germany come into it too, Jews from Germany too. But they're definitely secular. They're mostly anti-religious, and they would be divided into two groups, like the labor Zionists, who are more socialist, and then eventually from them a group would split off called the revisionist Zionists, and that's where Netanyahu's background is from. But anyway, but there's a lot more Jews in the world than just Jews in Eastern Europe or secular Zionist Jews from Eastern Europe. So how the other Jewish groups, or some of the other Jewish groups, reacted. There's the religious Zionists, and these were people who said that this secular colonization, they're secular, but it's okay because this is all part of the redemption. The secular are going to do it first, and then it's going to give way to a religious state. So they would give they were believing heavily cooperating with it. Then you had the ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they had there was two different points of view. There were some who were saying it was completely forbidden to build a state before the Messiah, and you couldn't do it. And then you had others who were saying that, well, yeah, it's not a good idea, and we shouldn't cooperate it any more than we have to, but it's not forbidden. I mean, it's not like we're not going to be autistic about it. And they were hostile towards it, not just for, not even really for theological reasons. Their main problem with it was that it was secular and that it was changing. It was called the Old Yishuv. Like before the secular Zionists showed up, all the Jews in the land of Israel were religious, and devout. And then all of a sudden you've got all these heretics and apostates coming in, totally changing the culture, of the Jewish portion of the country. They were really hostile to that. So that was a big part of it. Then the other is Middle Eastern Jews. And, you can, if you read the propaganda on both sides, you'll see like a really different stories, about the Middle Eastern Jews. They're called the Mizrahi Jews. And, the Arabs will say that the Mizrahi Jews were treated well in the Arab countries, and they weren't Zionists. They were either deceived or coerced by the Zionists to moving to Israel, and they faced a ton of racism. It's really just an Ashkenazic colonial project. And, but yeah, I mean, so really, like, and then sometimes they'll even say, well, they are Arabs themselves, they usually don't say this. Sometimes they'll say that they are Arabs, they're just Arabs who converted to Judaism. And then, like, the Zionist perspective you'll hear is, no, they were really persecuted, there was extreme anti-Semitism, and they were all very Zionist, and they wanted to come to Israel. And they were like super happy to leave Iraq or Morocco or Yemen or whatever. And the thing is, you read about it and it's kind of like both sides are right. They're both true, because it's really weird. I don't really get Mizrahi Jews, because here's the thing, like Mizrahi Jews are, I don't know if nationalist is the right word, but they're very strongly Zionist. And they do not like Palestinians at all. They're extremely like militant about it. Like Kahana, who I was talking about, his supporters were mostly Mizrahim. And so like they are really like big on the land of Israel and stuff like that, and very patriotic, and like serve and sacrifice for the country. But that being said, they really do. I mean, it might be different with the newer generation, but the older generations really did love Arab culture. And if you ask them, like, oh, what were your neighbors like in Baghdad, or your neighbors in Morocco, what were they like, your Arab neighbors? They were like, oh, they were great. We were friends. We loved them. And, and they really like, again, maybe not today with the newer generation, but they really like to watch like Arab TV shows and stuff. They like Arab food. And what's strange about that is because, like, my ancestors from Poland had absolutely nothing good to say about Poland or their Polish neighbors. I don't think that they really hated them. I just don't think that they interacted with them that much. And, but they certainly didn't like Poland. They thought it sucked. They thought it, was cold and miserable, and there were pogroms and stuff. So I think that's important, is that that, I mean, I think Judaism would have died out in the Arab countries anyway, but before the creation of the state of Israel, when like anti-Semitism went into overdrive, I mean, it does sound like they were pretty happy. Like, and they'll tell you, they'll be like, oh yeah, we were discriminated against, like there was discrimination against us, but the Arabs we were friends with were good, and we still had a really good life there. We were really happy. So, I don't know. Interpret that however you want. That seems to be the consensus of, that's at least what they say. So, all right. Now I want to talk about how Judaism and Zionism go together. Like, what's the differences, and are they the same thing, and how do they look at each other? Okay, this is So you go back, Judaism, we call it a Masorah, right? That's the tradition. So you have, the Torah and the Talmud, but you also have the writings of the sages over the course of thousands of years. Now, like, obviously, we don't have any writings of sages from like 500 BCE or whatever. So we start like getting their writings back into like the Talmuds, and mostly in like the 5th century, I guess. And then after that is when you start having like the writings that we have preserved, and so the sages. I want to talk about how their view of Jewish sages over the centuries towards the land of Israel, towards Aliyah, and towards the Palestinians. Okay, I think this really needs to be made clear. Okay, every single Jewish sage that we have before what's called the Haskalah, which is like the Jewish version of the Enlightenment that took place in Europe. So all the sages we have before then, they all said, and I want to emphasize this, all of them said this, that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people exclusively and for all time, and that nobody else has a right to live there. They were very clear about that. There's no dispute on that. And so, the reason I'm emphasizing this is because of this idea that Zionism is a new thing. Political Zionism is a new thing. But a lot of ideas that are often thought of or described as Zionist have been around forever. And, this is one of them. So that's something they were very clear about. On the subject of Aliyah, it does seem like it doesn't seem like, the overwhelming majority of sages said that it was important if a Jewish person was able to move to the land of Israel and live there, that it was a commandment, that they had to do that if it was possible. And sorry, I got a message. Now again, do as I say, not as I do. I'm not saying that everybody did it, certainly, but that was what. Now there were a couple. There were a few sages who said that, yeah, that was a commandment, but it doesn't apply anymore. That's true. So I just want to acknowledge that there were a few who said that. The overwhelming majority said it was a commandment, that you had to move there if you could do so. And the Palestinians, and this is what I think this is so important, okay? Especially what's going on now. There is, in Judaism, okay, there is no such thing as Palestinian rights. So you can be pro-Palestinian or whatever. And the thing is, but you can't say it has anything to do with Judaism. So like you'll see, it's not as bad now after October 7th, but you'll see stuff like Jews say like, oh, well, we can't like hurt the Palestinians or stuff like that. No, Judaism is very clear. And again, all the sages have said this, that the Palestinians need to be expelled from the land of Israel. They all say that, okay? Including the ones who said that Jews aren't required to move there necessarily. They all said that. The dispute was, do Jews need to do it themselves, or do they need to wait for the Messiah? But they all said that. And even today, all like real Jewish groups say that same thing. And you know what? I'm giving you an example. Like there's this ultra-Orthodox sect, a Hasidic sect called Satmar. They're Jews from Hungary. Their rabbi was, I forget his first name, but Teitelbaum was his last name, is the founder of it. They are extremely anti-Zionist. They don't have anything to do with the state of Israel. They won't take money from it. They encourage their followers they forbid their followers to even visit it. And, they don't it should not exist. During the war, the 1967 war, the Satmar Rebbe couldn't even bring himself to pray for Israel to win. Instead, he just said, we'll just pray that no Jews are hurt. But he couldn't make himself pray for the state of Israel to win. They hate this. He hated the state of Israel that much and was that opposed to it. Even he says that or said that when the Messiah comes, the Palestinians had to be expelled. So the thing is, like, so the whole thing about like driving the Palestinians out of their land, like, that's just Judaism. You don't have to like it. You can like it, or you can dislike it. You can be against it or whatever. But that is Judaism, and I just think it's so important that that gets emphasized, and that it's not something new. The Judaism has always taught this. So now there were, you didn't really see like a movement to make a state there to make a statement for the Jews to make a state in the land of Israel before the 1880s secular Zionism. However, you did have religious Jews in the Middle Ages and into the early modern times who were, like, before Zionism came, who were promoting this idea. Like, they would, but they were never like major rabbinical scholars or anything. They were religious, but they were just more talking like, hey, we should do this. And they would try to like see if they could get support for it from various leaders and stuff like that. And, they got some support at some times. But usually, nothing really ever came of it. And it never had like sanctioning from like the rabbinical authorities. I can't think of, I don't think there's ever been like any of the Jewish sages like were ever involved in actually organizing or advocating for some type of military takeover of Palestine, land of Israel, whatever you want to call it. So, and when Zionism finally does arrive, right, secular Zionism, the fact is all the rabbis then, the view towards it was overwhelmingly either ambivalent or outright hostile. And like, yeah, there were a lot of religious Zionists, there still are, but that wasn't the majority position. What happened is they realized like most of the ultra-Orthodox who, they either weren't really in favor of it or they were actually against it. They realized that they kind of needed to work with the secular Zionists just to make sure that their own followers could move to Israel, because everybody wanted to get out of Europe. And so they had to do like some work there. And then they were trying to preserve, remember I said the old Yishuv? They were trying to preserve Judaism or Jewish culture in the land of Israel. So they kind of had to participate, and they made their participation as distant as they could, but they had to participate. But it got to a point where there was no choice. Like, there was enough Jews there in Palestine that there was no choice but to make a state, because it was like you could either split the country and the Jews have one part of it and the Palestinians have another part, or you have all one state. But the problem is you couldn't do all one state, because then the Palestinians would just kill or drive out all the Jews living there. So it got to a point where there was no choice. You can basically describe it as like no refunds, and so most religious Jews weren't particularly enthusiastic about the state. Maybe some of them were for a little bit after the Holocaust, but they weren't like enthusiastic about it, but they just felt like it was like the least bad option, which is probably where most ultra-Orthodox Jews still are. And all of that brings us to today. And I said, and that's probably the only reason I'm talking about all this, is because of the rise of anti-Semitism today, which you saw really start after October 7th. And, I think it's actually increased since then. For a while it kind of went down for a little bit, but since then it's increased. At least online. And you have guys like, Nick Fuentes, he's a troll, right? But it's not just guys like Nick Fuentes, it's guys like Tucker Carlson, who's a real voice, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massey's kind of his own thing, but still he's somebody. And then if you look at public opinion polls, right? Like even amongst Trump voters like who are under 40 or 45 have a very, very negative view towards Israel. And so the reason why am I bringing all that up again? Oh. So anyway, so that's why, so we get to where we are today. And this goes back to, so I'll talk about it, how I feel, about it. Like, this, to me, October 7th and everything that's happened after it has shown a lot of the reasons that, because look, I know I'm not observant. I'm a bad Jew. I don't follow the commandments. Okay. But I am religious. I believe this stuff. I just don't practice it. And yeah, look, I'm really sympathetic with the anti-Zionist view, like the anti-Zionist religious view, because to me, creating the state has just caused a whole bunch of problems for us. And you see this thing like what you see now, like the kind of stuff you see now. Like, that's like when a state was created, all of this kind of shit became inevitable, and so like I'm not necessarily totally against it, because I've definitely heard religious Jews who argue in favor of the state, in favor of Zionism and the state of Israel, and I think they have points. It's just I'm not convinced by either side, I guess is what I'd say. Like, I really honest, I really don't know what the right thing to do. I mean, here, I think we can say, right, pretty clearly that right now there's no choice. Like, remember when I was saying the no refunds thing? Like, at this stage, there's no way out. So it's all really academic. Are we going to go relitigate shit that happened in the 20th century? There's no, there's what? It's like 6 or 7 million Jews who live in Israel right now. And the only way to, yeah, they're not safe now either. But if you get rid of the state, then they're all going to be dead or driven out. And they just aren't going to accept, they're not going to accept living under Arab rule anyway. And I don't blame them. So now it's too late. Now it's too late. So I think that to me is obvious. Was it right to build the state in the first place? I gotta say no. I think it was a mistake. I'm not a Torah scholar, so I can't tell you that for sure. I'm just telling you what I think. I think the Jews would have been better off if it hadn't been done. But I know I'm biased, obviously, because I hate secular Israeli culture so much. But that it's just what I think. It's my opinion only. I'm not an expert. I don't know anything. So, nobody should take it seriously. It's just that since this is my channel, I'm sure people would want to hear what I have to say, or at least I want to say it. That's just what I thought. I'm not sure about it at all. Just an opinion. But anyway, I want to talk, like I said, about America and Israeli politics in America now. And the first thing I want to talk about is something I'm sure you've all heard of called Hasbara. And yeah, Hasbara sucks. It's terrible. It's cringe. But the thing about Hasbara is the problem is actually in the name itself. Because do you know what Hasbara means? It means explaining. And which tells you a lot of just about how childish and naive the Israeli worldview is. They really think, oh, if we just explain to people what's really happening, they'll be on our side, or at least they won't be against us, because they live in they're a completely deluded people. They're just Israeli culture doesn't do it for me. Now I know that's that puts them in good company, right? Because I'm a misanthrope. I don't really like anybody, but still, Israeli culture sucks, and Israelis are totally deluded, and but also if you think about it, it goes even beyond that, right? Because everybody knows if you're explaining, you're losing. Okay? Everybody knows that. And, so it's so self-defeating. Another thing is you can explain all you want, but there's certain facts that just are there that on face value are very, favorable for the Palestinian narrative. So let's start at this, right? The pre-Zionism, it was basically a 100% Arab country. I think the Jews were literally less than 1% of the population. So we'll start there. Okay, Palestinians weren't bothering anybody. That's the first thing. The second thing, the state of Israel, when it was formed, was birthed on the back of massive forcible ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians who've been living in the pre-1967 borders of Israel. Something like 75% of the Gaza Palestinians, it might even be more than that, are refugees from 1967 Israel, from pre-1967 Israel. And over a quarter of the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria are. So the state of Israel only exists on the backs of driving hundreds of thousands of Palestinians out of their homes. That's fact number 2. And then fact number 3, Israel does kill very large amounts of Palestinian civilians. Now, these things, when you look at them in isolation, right? Or, not necessarily in isolation, but when you look at them, when you just say it that way, right? Without the broader historical context, it's all of those things are so divorced from the historical context that they have, from the overall historical context that it's relevant for them, that it's almost dishonest to even say those things. Okay, because it's such an oversimplification or one-sided view of it. Sure, okay, fair enough. It doesn't make those facts any less true. And those facts are all readily available. If you're going to take that surface level view of it, it's all there. The context isn't all there. And so how do you really deal with that? Right? You're not going to explain your way out of it. Furthermore, with Hasbara, I really strongly believe that that people who I don't really think anything you could say, even if you could narrow it down and explain things to everybody so they just understand. I don't think that's going to change a single person's opinion. I think that people who support the Palestinians are going to support them no matter what, and no facts would change their mind. People who are going to support the Jews are going to support the Jews no matter what, and no facts are going to change their mind. And then even today, even now, in this time, I really believe most people don't care one way or the other. They might have some sympathy towards one or the other. I think a lot of people just think both sides are shit. And I think the people who really don't care are not going to be moved by the facts on either side. So I think it's bad. Another thing is the Hasbara is simply bad. It's just not any good. I've talked about this before. One of my problems with Christian apologetics is, it's not that I disagree with it, because who cares, right? It's that it's just so terrible. I'll watch Christian apologists, on the Apologia channel and stuff, and I'll be like, I could do better than this. I'm not a Christian, and I could make a much better argument for Christianity than these guys do. And that's the same type of thing. I think Hasbara is a waste. I think it's stupid and retarded. It's not even a waste. I think it's counterproductive. But if I were doing it, I could do better than they. It's terrible. It's everything, every single piece of Hasbara I see, coming from Israel, it's can't you guys go 2 seconds without humiliating yourselves? It's bad enough. Right? People already hate us anyway. And all you're doing is making us, so instead of people who already thought we were evil, it's okay, now they think we're evil and cringe. This isn't helping. It's just stop. Now, you'll hear about stuff. So when it comes to Israel's influence in America, right? Things you'll hear about the ADL and AIPAC. The ADL is an evil organization. I have nothing good to say about it. So I'll leave it at that. AIPAC, look, I think their hearts are probably in the right place. So I'm not gonna the ADL is evil. I don't think AIPAC's evil. I think I think their heart's in the right place. I just don't agree with what they're doing. I don't think they have nearly the influence that their critics make them out to be. I think that this idea that AIPAC controls Congress, look, if it was true, I mean, I'd own it. I wouldn't care. I think what happened is that historically, and we're going to talk about this later, when you were with AIPAC, you all you had to do was vote for the pro-Israel stuff. They'd give you money, and then you don't have to worry about them giving money to any of your opponents. And it was politically an easy thing to do because being pro-Israel was a consensus position in American politics. So why not take their money? You're going to vote for all the stuff anyway. So this idea that and I think that foreign policy is controlled more by the executive and the State Department anyway, which I'm not saying that there isn't lobbying there too, but but that's lobbying, I don't think I'm not saying it doesn't do anything. I don't think it's a decisive factor of U.S. policy. I think the decisive factor, like why the U.S. has been so supportive of Israel, is because there's a real sympathy for Israel and for the Jewish people in the American leadership class especially, but also in the American population. And that's all changing, which is why we're talking about this now. But as it's changing, all of a sudden, you're going to see organizations like AIPAC losing a lot of their legendary influence because their influence was never really there to begin with. So, you see all this stuff, right? And I think it really went into overdrive with October 7th is what started, like you saw the anti-Semitism really from the left. I'm not saying it wasn't on the right, but it was. But where you really see it blow up on the right, though, was after Trump bombs Iran. And the reason for, but when you hear about all of this, you hear this thing of, it gets rolled into the whole America first thing. Like, we don't want any more wars. We don't want to, the Iraq war was for Israel. The Libya war was for Israel. We don't want to fight. We don't want to fight Israel's wars. And Israel should fight its own wars. And Marjorie Taylor Greene said this when Trump destroyed the nuclear stuff in Iran. She said it's not our fight. I can't remember if she said it's not our fight or it's not our war. And I know what they're saying, but just technically speaking, they're incorrect. Because, and I've talked about this before, as long as America, provides diplomatic cover to Israel and sells Israel weapons, forget about the aid. Okay, the aid obviously, but let's say the aid didn't exist. Let's say there was never a dollar of U.S. aid to Israel. You'd still have the issue of America continuing to provide diplomatic cover to Israel and selling it weapons. Well, if you do that, the problem with that is, people will bring up moral issues with it, say, oh, it's wrong to support Israel. But let's forget about the moral issues. The problem is when you do that, you're in the fight now. You are now involved in that war against Israel and whoever's pretty much the entire Islamic world, because they're all after them and stuff. So, and it's made even worse because inevitably those weapons you sell are going to be used against Arab civilians. Or, I'm not saying necessarily directly, but you're going to see Arab, or Palestinian, but other Arab kids get killed and then be blasted to the entire Islamic world on Al Jazeera saying, look what the Jews have done with these American weapons. So so you're in the fight. There's no way to, so it does be kind of like, maybe it shouldn't be America's war, but it is, it now is. And so it gets to a point, right, where the only way for America to not be involved, to not have to worry about Iran or any other countries, is for the United States to just disengage from Israel. Now, I'm not saying that the U.S. has to put sanctions on Israel or cut off diplomatic relations, but I'm saying that you basically, if the U.S. doesn't want any of this smoke, so to speak, the only way is going to be to say we're not going to veto any more anti-Israel resolutions. If countries want to boycott or sanction Israel, we're not going to punish them, and we're not going to sell Israel weapons. And now, look, I think that's really good policy. I don't think the U.S. should be. I think the U.S. needs to disengage from Israel. I'm not, again, it's really just like my opinion thing. I'm not saying everybody has to agree with me, but that's just what I think. But the thing is, it doesn't matter what I think or what you think, for that matter. Okay. What matters is that historically, the U.S. has only been able to support Israel as heavily as it has because there was a political consensus for doing it, or at least not a political consensus against doing it. What you're seeing now is the real growing of a new consensus that's against it. It doesn't even have to be a consensus. All you need is, if you got half basically you're going to get to a point pretty soon where half of the party, the Democrats are going to be taken over by somebody eventually who's just is against all, weapon sales to Israel and diplomatic cover for Israel. It's inevitable. It might not happen in 28. It will happen. The Republicans probably aren't far behind. They're going to be there. So there's it's just where things are going. Okay. You can agree with it, not agree with it. There's no stopping it. It's inevitable at this point. Now I think that's for the best, but it doesn't matter. Like I said, it doesn't matter what I think. It's what's going to happen. As for the war itself, remember the whole thing happened because a lot of people will even say like, oh, this was Israel let October 7th happen on purpose for an excuse to invade Gaza. No. You guys are giving Israelis way too much credit. And like, I think like, Nick Fuentes had a thing, right, where he was saying that Israel's goal is to expand to greater Israel, which is Nile to the Euphrates, expel all the Arabs that are living there, and then rebuild the third temple. It's like, well, yeah, that is what Jews have been praying for thousands of years. That's true. But the idea that, there's like a plan by the current Israeli leadership to do that is insane. It's you don't know Netanyahu, you don't know the IDF. I took criticism from my own viewers when I said that if it were up to Netanyahu and the IDF, there would have been no military response to October 7th. And I stand by that. And I don't expect you guys to agree with it because you don't know what these guys are like. You don't know what these guys are like. Now, Netanyahu, Bibi, his heart's at least usually in the right place, but he's a secular Zionist. He's a secular revisionist Zionist. And in Israel, I know that he's got some reputation amongst non-Jews as being like this right-wing nationalist. Nobody in Israel sees him that way. I mean, he's basically seen as a weakling and a coward. And, like, he is nationalistic, but in a very archaic, like, like early 20th century style way. And in a very secular way. He's all about like Israel's place amongst the nations. And you'll see, like, he never, like, his idol is Winston Churchill, Winston Churchill is a hero, don't get me wrong, but he was like, that's like, he's got a very secular Western mindset. And the IDF, don't even get me started. Like, they absolutely would not have invaded if they could. So, like, the idea that Netanyahu or the IDF wanted to conquer Gaza is crazy. It's just so insane. And if anybody who says that, you can just ignore anything else they say because it just isn't true. No, like so the issue, like Israel's losing to Gaza, which is not a surprise. That's what the IDF does. They lose everything. Now, look, they surprised me. They did really well against Iran. I wasn't expecting that. I didn't even. I really thought the IDF would refuse the order if Netanyahu even gave it, but I guess Trump gave them the courage. But they also defeated Lebanon in the last war, and I was sure they would lose to Lebanon. So okay, look, I don't bat 1,000. I get a lot of stuff wrong, but there's reasons for me to think this stuff. I mean, again, before that Lebanon invasion, Israel had lost every war for 50 years. So, like, how was I supposed to know that, okay, they're finally going to win one? And the Iran thing, it's like they haven't done something like that in, like, again, it's like 50 years. Like, why would I have expected them to do that? But they did lose in Gaza, just like I said they would. And the thing is with Gaza, basically, the whole problem with Gaza is the IDF and Netanyahu want a ceasefire. I know sometimes people say they don't. They do. The thing is that they're in a situation where they kind of can't agree to it because Hamas is saying that, okay, we'll have a ceasefire. We'll give you your hostages back, but you've got to release pretty much every murderer that's like every terrorist that's in Israeli prisons, which don't get me wrong, they'll agree to that. That's not a problem. But, and then here's the real problem. You have to leave every inch of Gaza. Again, if it were up to Netanyahu and the IDF, they would take it in a heartbeat. The problem is they can't do it because so many soldiers died conquering it. And then all the people who live on the Gaza border are going to know, like, wait a minute, there's no buffer zone. It's only a matter of time before it happens again, which means that the IDF and Netanyahu are going to have to take a defeat. So they're going to, like, not only did they lose this war, but they lost a whole bunch of soldiers for it, and their credibility is just shot. And now the IDF would probably be okay. Would probably okay with that because they know that everybody hates them anyway and thinks they're losers. But Netanyahu politically can't do that. So we're in this kind of like permanent no man's land. The hostages are stuck there, and that gets to like, like, so what do I think should be done? Because I could do, like, if I were in charge, a whole lot of things would change. Maybe they would be the right decisions. Maybe they wouldn't. I don't know. It's all in God's hands. But what I can tell you is that, like, what should happen, the one thing is that basically you have to make a decision. Either surrender, admit defeat to Hamas, leave and get the hostages back. Wait for the next attacks, but at least the war will be over. Or reconquer Gaza. Conquer, Gaza City and all the other things. So, Netanyahu being Netanyahu, he's trying to do this thing where he's like just threatening to conquer Gaza City. The IDF is fighting it tooth and nail because they're just evil pieces of shit. They're even threatening to refuse orders, which again tells you all you need to know about the IDF. So what I'm thinking though, what I'm guessing will happen, this is a very prediction. Again, don't look, Israel could just surrender. That would be like, historically, that's usually what they do. And it might even be the smartest decision. But if Hamas still refuses to bend at all, then what you're probably going to have happen is Israel will launch the operation into Gaza City. And it'll be like a mission creep type thing. The idea is like, oh, we're not going to take over all of Gaza, just Gaza City. But, that's how the first Lebanon war started. They were supposed to go in 40 kilometers, and they went all the way to Beirut. They weren't even supposed to be in as deep in Gaza as they are now. So you go to Gaza City, but my guess is that eventually it leads to a situation where year or 2 years, whatever, Israel just ends up retaking the entire Gaza Strip, putting it under military rule, which could have been done in the first couple of weeks with a lot less bloodshed. But that's, Israel and the IDF for you. So anyway, like I said, send it to anybody who's interested in the conflict. That's all for now. See you in the next.